so much. Thank you, everybody. So excited to be here, Christian. I love you as a host. I love the energy you bring. And Daniel, thank you so much for just inviting me to be here. I have to also give a shout out to my sister Karina for just extending and recommending me to be in this space. I am so honored, and I thank Trinity for having this forum to have this very difficult but important conversation. So for those of you who do not know me, I want to tell you I'm someone who has a background in preaching in church. And if you know anything about preachers, we love crowd participation, okay? So it's difficult for me when I want to shout and run around the room. I can't do that from my chair. So I need help from you, and I need you to talk back to me, whether it's in the chat or you're feeling something, you can do your fingers, clap, do something. Just help me know that you're tracking with me, okay? And with my ministry, Faith on the Journey, one thing that you will know, I call people family. So when I'm addressing you, sometimes you'll hear me say fam, and that's because we're all part of one family as the body of Christ. And so you will hear me refer to you as family. But I'm going to bring my presentation up on the screen and share this. Give me 1 second to share. Okay, hopefully you all can see my screen all right. And I'm going to bring it up from the beginning here. Okay, so we are going to start off with the reality. Just get this out in the forefront that 2020 has been a year for us, baby. Okay, we can acknowledge that. I remember by March, I was sitting here thinking like, what is happening? I am just over this year, not knowing that things will just progress, and so much more has unfolded since March when we first got hit with the pandemic. And today, obviously, we're talking about the subject of collective racial trauma. And there's so much that could be said about this. And I'm going to try my best to speak to this topic. And so for me, I'm going to start off with just a story. I'm going to ask you to use your Holy Ghost imagination with me for just a moment. Okay. And when I'm speaking about this, I want you to think about this scenario in the mindset of what's happening in this country today and the subject of the hour. So we have Thanksgiving coming up, right? We're almost through the summer. The summer is pretty much over. Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday. We get to eat, and eating is my favorite pastime, okay? So we're eating with family, celebrating with those we love. So I just want you to imagine yourself at the Thanksgiving table, and you with family, you're excited, you're about to cut the turkey, you see the mac and cheese that grandma hooks up over there, you got the collard greens, you got all this good food, and you just ready to eat because you haven't eaten all day, so you're just ready. Okay, so they bless the food, and you sit down and you get your plate and about to start eating, and then all of a sudden you kind of hear some noise at the side, the end of the table. It sounds like people are kind of getting into this heated discussion, and you look over to the side and be like, oh, okay, that seems kind of heated over there, but this mac and cheese over here is good. Grandma put her foot in it, so I ain't even gonna pay attention to what's going on over there. So you just keep eating your food, and then you finally say, okay, now they getting loud. This is getting real over here. So you look over to the side and you see, and finally, one of the people who was arguing stands up and says, you know what? I am tired of everybody acting like abuse did not take place in this family. And I'm tired of everybody sweeping this under the rug. We're going to talk about this today. And you look over to the side and say, oh, it just got real. Pin drop. And so people respond to situations like that differently. So you got that one auntie who hates conflict. And so what she does, she goes into the kitchen and she grabs her famous pie and she brings it out and says, pie anybody? Just trying to ignore the fact that we just had a whole conversation, whole blow up in the situation, right? So she just don't like conflict. So she's choosing to ignore what happened. Then you got the other auntie. Oh, she's just a mess. She's like, oh my God, I can't believe this just happened. Oh my God, like this, so she's hysterical. She's just crying and she just doesn't know what to do with her emotions. And then you got this one person over here who is just so angry, just pointing fingers at what's taking place. So they're just blaming everybody. It's your fault. If this didn't happen, we would never be here. So they're blaming, right? Then you got one person who's just ready to fight. They angry at what took place. Then you got another one who's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, I'm just here for the food. Like, what's going on, right? So you got that person. Then you got that other person who's ashamed because they knew the abuse took place, but they chose to ignore it. And so you got all these emotions taking place in the sense of this, inside of this family, when the secret that people knew about, that they tucked away in the closet, finally was exposed and put right in front of them to the point where they could not ignore it anymore. And this is exactly what is happening today in our country. America's family secret is racism. And for so long, we have tried to act like this part of our history was behind us. We tried to convince ourselves that we are in a post-racist society. We had a Black president, we have integrated schools, we got all these things going on, when reality is still there. And so what we're seeing happening right now today is that people are at a point where they're fed up. And they're like, no, we're going to talk about what's happening right now. We're not going to sweep this under the rug. But just like at this dinner table, at this catastrophe, if you will, that we saw happen with the chaos, everybody responds in moments like this differently. Some people want to deny it's happening. Some people want to try to fix it and just wants us all to get along. Some people are crying and just don't know what to do with their emotions. Some people are ready to fight. Some people feel so much shame. So we have all this taking place right now, and we don't know what to do with emotions. And so I want us to kind of think about that and keep that in the back of the mind, that we are having a conversation amongst family members about a very difficult conversation that should have happened a long time ago. And anytime you're dealing with issues like this that deal with pain, there's going to be emotions that just come out, emotions that you feel that you don't even know what to do with, but they're real to you. And so we have to have these conversations, and we have to learn that we're going to have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. This is not an easy conversation, but we have to have it. And we also have to acknowledge the racial trauma and how it affects all of us. This doesn't affect just one people group. This affects us all. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as I go throughout my presentation. We also, as my brother Christian said earlier when he was laying down the ground rules, we have to listen to understand. This is a topic where people can often get defensive because it plucks away at certain beliefs or things that have taken place, or societal or systemic problems. And so let's just drop the defense. Let's be open-minded. This is not about blaming. This is about learning and understanding and growing together. And then this is a saying I'm borrowing from someone who I admire, who does a lot of work in healing. Healing is a contact sport. For anybody who's out there who plays, any type of sport, you have to be actively involved. Like, so when it comes to healing, this is something that you just can't say, oh, I feel bad, that's so terrible, or let me just pray about it. No, as believers, as my brother Chris, who prayed earlier today, we're called to do some work around this, to help others heal from this issue of racial trauma. You tracking with me? Let me know how you all doing. All right, okay. And so before I kind of get into what is racial trauma and collective trauma, I want to kind of give you a little background. And this is just me sharing a little bit of my story as an African-American woman and an experience that I had that was very transformative for me. I had the opportunity to go to Ghana earlier this year before the pandemic hit. And it was a wonderful experience. We went to see various landmarks, and you see me over on the right-hand side. I'm dipping my hands in the water where my ancestors took their last bath before they were shipped off into slavery. And so it was very emotional. It was, something that I thank God I had the opportunity to experience. And one of the most powerful moments of my journey was when I went to the slave castles. These are the dungeons where slaves were kept underground. And we went down into these dungeons. And when I tell you, it was so eerie, just to stand on the ground where feces had cemented for centuries. And we said it was like a smell that you can still see. And it was just so eerie and to see how so many hundreds of slaves were just cramped into that little small space. And all you could do is just sit there and just imagine what it was like. But to me, what was so disturbing beyond just the setting that we were in was the fact that our tour guide pointed up and said, you see that hole right there in the ceiling? He was like, that's where the masters will look down at the slaves, and the hole is located right outside the place of worship. If you caught what I just said, the slave masters would worship God right above the slave dungeons. And for me, that was such a disconnect. It was like, how can you worship God? What God are you worshiping to say that it is okay to treat others like animals and then say, we're acting as Christian? I couldn't understand that. And to think that we say that we're made in the image of God. We talk about the Imago Dei, right? And we're all made in his image and likeness. And yet you still think that's okay to do that. And our professor had to really put things in perspective for me, to help me to understand that. Because if you consider yourself to be a moral being, if you consider yourself to have a conscience, you have to be able to justify that type of behavior. And the way in which they were able to justify treating individuals as less than human was to dehumanize them. And so that's exactly what took place. When it came to slavery, before chattel slavery, slavery wasn't like the way we see it in the 1600s and on. Before, they looked at as slaves as actually being human. But when chattel slavery came around, we were less than human. This door right here, they made this door so much smaller. I can't show you, but if you can see the edges, they made the door smaller just to paint a picture that you are animalistic, you're less than human on purpose. And what took place when I looked out that door, it's more than just, this is the door of no return, by the way. This is the door that slaves entered. They left the slave castles and entered into the slave ships to go out into slavery. I need you to get this. It was more than just them crossing a threshold when they went out of the door of no return. What went out of the door of no return was a virus. It was a virus that infected the world to make it seem, to make you believe that it is okay to treat another human being as less than human. And this virus has infected us all. And we know we're talking about viruses, right? I use that word virus because this is something that is serious. Racism is as serious and as real as the air we breathe. And we're all infected by it. No one is beyond it. And I understand that sometimes people like to say, like, I don't see race, I don't see color, but it's impossible because it's baked into our society. So even if you have diverse friends and you never used a racial slur in your life, there's certain systems that are in place that infects us. There's certain things that are happening in your subconscious mind that you're not even aware of because we live in a racialized society. So I'm going to give you what this means, right? So racialized society is a society where race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships. And that's just at a basic definition. And so we all are experiencing the consequences of this racial construct that was created by man. Race was created to be able to justify the type of treatment and behavior that individuals who are oppressed are experiencing right now. So that leads me into trauma, which is what we're talking about today, the different types of trauma. So we look at historical trauma, and historical trauma is related to the trauma that a shared group experiences collectively, which spans generations. And this is something where individuals carry trauma-related symptoms who never actually experienced that particular trauma itself. So we look at slavery, that's the perfect example of historical trauma that we're still experiencing as African Americans today. And again, I don't have time to go into different people groups because other people groups have been oppressed and hurt by racism, but that's just a quick example. But transgenerational trauma is another. So when we look at transgenerational trauma, that is for a specific family line. So when you look at, trauma that's passing from one generation to the next, a lot of times you might call that a stronghold within the family system. And sometimes there's being research done about the effects of trauma as it relates to DNA and how it changes your DNA and can pass down to one generation to the next because of the trauma that was experienced. And so that's something that's going down the same family line. Then we have personal racial trauma. So that's an experience where, for example, if someone calls you a racial slur of some kind, then that's personally like racial trauma that you're experiencing. One of my good girlfriends talked about how in my grade school or high school, her brother, and this was like in the 90s or 2000s, was called the N-word by his teacher. That's personal racial trauma because that happened to him like in a personal level. Then we have physical trauma. So that's something that we all saw and witnessed, and we have been witnessing time and time again with the killing and the murder of George Floyd. Right? We saw that. We saw the physical trauma. We've seen that time and time again with some of these senseless killings and murders. So watching that take place, that's physical trauma actually happening to your body. But then that brings in another element. I'm using that George Floyd example for a reason, because we look at vicarious trauma and secondary trauma. So vicarious trauma is trauma that someone is repeatedly exposed to over time that eventually leads to them having their own trauma. So you might see somebody who works in the social work field who experiences this, or it can happen to a people group who constantly sees trauma happening to someone that reminds them of themselves. It can lead to vicarious trauma. Or secondary trauma by just watching that George Floyd killing. I've heard a lot of individuals say that just did something to my soul. To watch him call out for his mother, and to experience it and see the whole footage, it did something to them. And they were probably experiencing secondary trauma. Then we have microaggressions. And this is something where often is not as overt that an oppressed people group might experience. From personal experience, I've had this happen before where someone will say to me after I've given a presentation, they might be like, "Oh, you are just so articulate. Wow, you are just so smart." And I'm sitting here like, well, I shouldn't be articulate. Like, what is it? What are you saying? And some might, say like, "Oh, I might be being oversensitive," but to a people group who's been told that they're dumb or they're not articulate, it could be translated to me as you are articulate for a Black person, which can be considered a microaggression. Or when someone is being traced in a convenience store, they're being followed because of the color of their skin. That is considered a microaggression because someone could argue who is on the side of actually doing the microaggression. I was just giving you a compliment, or I wasn't following you because of your race, but we have a different experience from our history, and so it could be interpreted in different ways, and that could be considered a microaggression. Then we have racial gaslighting. This is something I experienced just the other week when I made a post on social media about a protest that was being done, a boycott by the NBA over a recent murder not an assault, but a police assault of a Black man. And in that, I just said, yes, I said, this is great. I'm glad they're boycotting. And the person responded by saying, well, I don't agree with them boycotting for this person. This person was a criminal. They should have listened to police. This is something that just doesn't make sense to me. And, I'm open to engaging with conversation with people. So I was like, you know what? I don't even know all the details of the case. But even if he did have a criminal background that has nothing to do with this individual being, attacked and assaulted and shot. And then from that conversation there, it went on to him becoming much more aggressive and saying he deserved it, he's a criminal, he should have responded to the police. If he didn't get aggressive with the police, he would not have been. So if you're following me with this story, gaslighting is really saying, if this person didn't do this, then they would not be in the situation. It's their fault, right? And so moving along, these are some things that can happen when it comes to racial trauma. The last one really quickly is something called moral injury, where we might feel as if someone who is in a state of power, like for instance, a member of church, they, or law enforcement, a parental figure, could have failed to act justly or compassionately. In other words, they could have done more. And so we're hurt by the fact that that person did not do more. Or a person acts in a way that deeply goes against their beliefs. And that's when the shame comes in, and that's where the disappointment comes in when it comes to moral injury. So I'll move quickly because I know I'm getting short on time here. So trauma defined. Trauma, many people think of trauma as just an incident that takes place, like a violent occurrence, a threat to one's physical existence, someone being killed, a car accident. And yes, that is trauma. That's the physical experience that many of us are familiar with. But it goes beyond that. And for this conversation, I want to talk about the neurobiological response that we need to be aware of, which affects us today. Because there's something that happens to our brains when we feel like we're in danger. It sends a response to our brain that signals a neurobiological response that we need to kick in, that survival mechanism. We go into fight or flight mode, or freeze, as many people are aware of. And that's saying, look, I need to do whatever I need to do to survive. The body takes over at that point. Our prefrontal cortex shuts down and says, okay, I need to handle my business to make it out of this situation. And so this is important when it comes to the conversation we're having, okay? Then when we think about complex trauma, people who have been exposed to trauma over and over and over again, it can get to the point where they're in a constant threat response state, where they're constantly, they're hyper aware, they're in this overdrive state, where they're constantly or fight or flight mode in this. Their innate response is different. Now, everyone has a different response to trauma. Like we talk about fight, flight, or freeze. So people respond differently to trauma, but nonetheless, it's important to understand that when you feel like you're in danger, you will respond without even understanding what's going on. Your body has responded before you. Now, this is important to know for what the next slide I'm going into. This can also cause long-term health consequences, which we are kind of seeing revealed through some of the statistics studied through COVID with minority groups. But here's the question to ask. How has my group, or how have I, not my people group, but how have we been socialized to perceive danger and respond to trauma? Because we've been socialized by society to respond to trauma and to see certain things as being dangerous. And when we see certain things as being dangerous, that causes us to have a trauma response. So let's think about this. Birth of the Nation, right? We see Birth of a Nation. It's the story in the 1916 of this Black man who's coming after this white woman to take her precious virginity, and she runs and she jumps off the cliffs because she doesn't want to be raped by this man. And so then the white men, the KKK come, and they take him up and they save the day, right? So this was back early 1900s. We look at what took place with Emmett Till, young man, goes down from Chicago to Mississippi, is accused of whistling at a white woman. Then white men come, save the day, kill Emmett, and brutally beat him, right? So this is a narrative. So let's fast forward. What do we see here? Constant images of Black men demonized, dehumanized, going back to that door of no return, as animals, thugs, criminals, gangsters. These terms, not just thugs, but then we talk about illegal immigrants, okay? We talk about aliens. These terms are used to dehumanize, stigmatize individuals as other, so you can treat them as less than. All right, so when you have all these things come into play, this is causing us to perceive, at least in this people group, individuals as dangerous. So now when something happens, you can have a trauma response. This is case in point, 2020, a trauma response because you perceive something as dangerous because you have been conditioned, socialized to think that way. Think about if some black men walk down the alley, you grab your purse, socialized to think a certain way. So let's look at this case here. We have Christian Cooper, Amy Cooper in the park. This is early in May 2020. And Christian Cooper, he's handling his business. I think he's bird watching. He comes across Amy. She doesn't have her dog on a chain, and that's the rules. You need to have your dog on a leash. So he approaches her about that and says, "Hey, can you put your dog on a leash?" This is her response. And he was not over the top. He was cordial. But let's look at what happened.
Please don't come close to me.
Sir, I'm asking you to stop recording me.
Please don't come close to me.
Please take your photo.
Please don't come close to me.
I'm taking pictures on the bus.
Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African American man threatening my life. I'm sorry, I'm in a ramble, and there is a man, African American, he's a bicycle helmet. He is recording me and threatening me and my dog. There is an African American man, I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog.
Okay, so I have to keep moving this along. So her response, this was just what took place. I'm not saying she's a bad person. I'm not trying to defend any of her behavior. She apologized at the end of it. I want to point out to you that I suggest to you that this was more than just her conscious mind responding in this moment. Because of her being a part of a racialized society, and being socialized to see and perceive certain individuals a certain way. Biologically, going back to what I said earlier, we can have a trauma response that just kicks in gear right away. And for her, in that moment, she's claiming that she believed that she was in danger. We look at another case, very high profile, stand your ground case, George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin. Young man with skills in his pocket, with his hoodie on, was chased, shot down. Didn't have anything he wasn't violent, he wasn't a threat. However, George Zimmerman's argument was that he got off for killing Trayvon, was the fact that he thought he was in danger, even though he was chasing after Trayvon. So you see how this affects our thought process. And we look at this, it's not even just those who might be on the side of oppressing. We also look at how it affects those who are a part of a minority group or oppressed, because we also have such a thing as internalized racism, where we no longer see ourselves as beautiful, valuable, or as humans, and we start to act out in a way that says otherwise, that I need to be more like the other so that I can be accepted. So you look at this picture, bleaching is something that's very common in certain groups. To say, I don't like how I look. I don't like how I am. I need to be more normal or right. And so this, again, is a part of trauma. This is a result of trauma and years of conditioning. I'm almost done. I know I'm running out of time. The last point I want to make is, let's think about a police stop that we have. All of us have, I don't know if everybody's been stopped by the police, but many of us have been stopped by the police. And it's something where it's like, oh my God, Lord, like you get nervous when you get stopped, right? And that's a natural response. But I suggest to you a response of someone who is a part of a people group who have been oppressed, who've been victimized, is probably much different than someone who is white. Because instead of saying, I hope I don't get a ticket, or will I get a ticket? The question becomes something different. The question then becomes, will I survive? What will happen to me? And then going back to seeing people time and time again be oppressed, we can get to the point where we go into that survival mode and we say, wait, I need to fight. I need to fight for my life. And so you might see someone get aggressive. at a police stop. You might see someone, you know, mouthing off, and you're like, well, why didn't they just listen to the police? They're in survival mode. They sense danger. When they see police, they sense danger. And so that's an automatic response. And so let's think about these things as we move forward. And this is my last slide before we go into breakout groups. I just want to say this is heavy stuff. I'm trying my best to cram it in 20 minutes. I'm sorry if I went over, but I just want to say there is hope. There's still hope in all of this, because at this point, the family secret is out. There's no more putting this back in. We're talking about it. We have to talk about it. And in doing so, it's empowering, because then at that point we can work towards doing something about it. And I think people are more open to listening. But the conversation has to happen at the family table with the family of believers. We need to lead the way. We need to lead the charge. We can't be like the woman grabbing pie, acting like everything is okay. No, we have to actually have the conversation first and be willing to lead the charge. And so for our breakout sessions, there's 3 things I'm asking you all to do. First is to create a timeline. You identify someone who's a scribe in your breakout group, and you get a piece of paper and you create a timeline of events that have taken place in 2020 that have caused collective racial trauma. Now, honestly, we don't have, there's a lot that's happened in 2020. So I'm asking you to do maybe like 5 or so minutes of this activity of just jotting down some major events that come to mind. Then what was your trauma response to these events? And then the last question is, have you been able to effectively talk about these feelings with people outside of your race? If so, what was that experience like for you? If not, what's made it so difficult for you to have that conversation?